continuing our study in Philippians. Often you have these books that are attached in there like Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and they really don't have too much connection to each other geographically or historically. And so we just study them sometimes as individual detached books, not understanding some of the background material of the things. And Philippi is an interesting city. It's actually at the gateway between Europe. It's on the European side between Europe and Asia, and was very prominent in times. It was originally inhabited by the Thracians, who were very fierce type of people. I think that they were also used as slaves and gladiators, and when they were captured, and but they were displaced by Philip of Macedonia, King Philip, who's interesting in history. He's the father of Alexander the Great, and he came in there and beat them, and took this city, and he renamed it after himself and ran his operations out of there. He was a king there in Philippi. Today, Philippi is not occupied as far as I know. I don't think it's a city even today. It's in a very fertile place and still at the gateway. The Romans came there, and the battle, it was a very turning battle in the Roman Empire because it was the end of the Roman Republic was established there in a battle between Brutus and Cassius. And it meant it was fought right at this site of Philippi. And it was the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. The place also was then, when it was taken by the Romans and established, they set it up as a Roman colony. It was on the what was known as, I think, the Ignatius or Ingatius Way. It was their road from Rome to Asia. And it passed through there, and to maintain this position, just like the British used Singapore, Gibraltar, and certain Hong Kong, and certain cities around the world to establish their empire, they established this as a Roman colony. They didn't have very many of these, but they used this as a control point on their road to Asia. And this city was interesting in the sense that it was occupied by Roman citizens, which was very unusual. These were retired military people for the most part. Also in the city, there is not a synagogue, which is unusual, because Paul in their travels always went to the synagogues first. But you'll notice in this city, there is not a synagogue. They went out to pray, the Jews did, and the righteous people out by a river near the city, because the Romans didn't allow a synagogue in their colony, evidently. And we don't know the whole history of this. This book is also very interesting because it tells us a lot of things that we don't see in this passage that we're going to cover in Philippians 2 about some of the people, Timothy, Epaphroditus, Paul himself, and his relationship to these people. But we know historically, also from the book of Acts, there's a strong tie between Paul and these Philippians. And I'd like to read this passage in Acts so you get a flavor of who these people are. Now, what happened was Paul, on his first missionary journey, he went up to Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, and Lystra, and then came back to work out of Antioch, the other Antioch. And in the second missionary journey, they had the discussion in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 of did the Gentiles have to become Jews to get circumcised and everything to become believers, to be saved? And that was decided, no, that was not the case. So now he goes out on the second journey, and he starts out with Barnabas. There's a heated discussion over taking John Mark, and they end up splitting. And this time he goes out with Silas, and they start up, and they're going to revisit Lystra and Derbe. But they're going by the land route this time, not by the sea. The first time they went through Cyprus and up. This time they're going to come in and go up to visit them. And let me pick this story up here in Acts 16. Then he, talking about Paul, came to Derbe. This is Acts 16, verse 1. came to Derbe and Lystra. And behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but whose father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were at Lystra and Iconium. So he's well known in this whole region, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. Timothy is. And you know that his mother, it was Eunice and Lois, even his grandmother is well known as believers, evidently Jewish believers. Paul wanted to take him with him, and he took him and circumcised him because the Jews who were in the region, for they all knew his father was a Greek. He's from a mixed marriage. So he circumcised him so that he'd be known as fully as a Jew. And as they went through the cities, they delivered to them the decrees to keep, which were determined by the apostles and elders at Jerusalem. That's in the last chapter at the Jerusalem Council. So he's now got a message from the elders and the apostles in Jerusalem that no, you just have to abstain from certain things, blood, things offered sacrifices to idols and things like that, which is very encouraging to these Gentile believers because most of them are Gentiles, although there are Jews in these synagogues. So the churches were strengthened in faith and increased in number daily. Remember the first time, Paul had a very difficult time in these places, going up through there, and they were wanted to sacrifice to them as Zeus and Hermes, and only they got them stopped. But then the same city, they stoned him to death outside, and he comes back in. But he wasn't afraid. He went through there, and they pursued the people in Iconium, and Antioch sent him down to Derbe and Lystra to stir up trouble. But he wasn't afraid, and he went back through the same places. So Paul established for them that you stand up in the face of persecution and come back. So these people were pretty well established. So the churches were strengthened by this additional news that they didn't have to become Jews. The Gentiles did. And then when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, they were forbidden by the Holy Spirit to preach the word in Asia. It's interesting, the book of Galatians, for instance, Paul had never worked really there. He passed through their territory, but he's forbidden by the Spirit to do it. And when he writes the book of Galatians, to the Galatians, he is writing to people he's never met. That's not going to be the case of the Philippians. But he's forbidden, and we don't know what the reason is for this. They're not allowed to evangelize in Galatia and Phrygia. Then they came to Mysia, which is further north. And they tried to go into Bithynia, which is to the northeast of where they are. But the Spirit did not permit them. Again, the Spirit stopped them from the time that they're in Derbe and Lystra. As they're moving north, he forbids them to evangelize in these territories. Very strange. So they end up coming up to the very threshold, to the Asian side of the Hellespont there, the Dardanelles, to a place called, they came to Troas, which is right on the sea there. And the vision appeared to Paul in the night. And a man of Macedonia stood and pleaded with him, saying, "Come over to Macedonia to help us." Macedonia is north of Greece. That's where Philippi is. And Alexander the Great actually came from this area. He had Aristotle as his teacher. Philip, his father, the king, had Aristotle teach him. And even though they weren't Greeks, they went down and conquered Greece later. And so he was up from this area, but he has a vision. Paul has a vision. This man of Macedonia says, "Come on over." There's a vision in the night, evidently. Now, when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia. Now, you notice in the book of Acts, up to this point, Luke has always written in the third person. He says they, he, they. Now he says we. So evidently at this point in the narrative, Luke is joining them in these travels. Luke, the physician, who is, we think, is probably a Gentile. We're not sure, but he wrote the book of Luke and this book of Acts, major portions of the New Testament. It says, we sought to go to Macedonia, concluding that the Lord had called us to preach the gospel to them. He's been forbidden, and now he's called over to preach. And he's going to cross over now, and this is going to be, Philippi becomes the first church in Europe. Very significant. And he has a vision, and they go over there. Therefore, sailing from Troas, we made a straight course to Samothrace, and the next day came to Neapolis. It means a new city. And from there to Philippi, which is the foremost city of that part of Macedonia, a colony. It means by that a Roman colony. And we were staying in the city for some days. You know, their custom was always to go to synagogue. There's no synagogue, so they're there several days. But it says, and on the Sabbath day we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily held. And we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira. Thyatira is back down toward, it's north and east, I think, of Ephesus. She is a seller of purple. Purple came from, I think, sea urchins, where they got this purple deal, and they used it for dyeing. It was very highly sought after and expensive. And this woman had developed a trade out of that, but was moving over here, which was a port city in Europe, whereas Thyatira is actually in Asia. We don't know the full background. However, she does have a full household at this point, and she's evidently the head of her household. Nothing's mentioned of her husband, who worshiped God, and the Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." So she persuaded us. This is the first person in Philippi. Significant. It's a woman that's the head of a household, and they all believe. This is done in about 49 to 50 AD. Paul writes Philippians about 10 years later, in 60, and he's writing it from prison in Rome. Okay, so this is 10 years later. So Lydia is probably one of the people in her household, or probably some of the families that they're certainly there in Philippi still. They go to stay at her house. Now it came to pass as we went to prayer, and evidently back to the same place by the river, that a certain slave girl possessed with a spirit of divination met us. It was brought out that this morning in the previous message that, like in the case of Pharaoh's magicians, they could do supernatural events. Well, this girl supernaturally, through the power of an evil spirit, is able to do fortune telling. And it brought her masters much profit by fortune telling. This girl followed Paul and us, crying out and saying, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." You'd always think that this would be a great thing to happen, that even the demons recognize this. But you remember in the life of Paul, of the life of Christ, what he did? They said, "Oh, you're the Most High, you're the Son of God, the Most High, the Holy One of Israel." And he commanded them to be silent. To get the testimony of demons is not beneficial or acceptable. It wasn't to Jesus, and it's not going to be to Paul. And you'd think, well, everyone knows that this is what's going on here, and this is a great entrant to evangelism. Never work with demonic powers, no matter what they say. And that's why you also don't intertwine yourself with these false cults and religious things, which may use part of the truth. And I know if you've ever been approached by the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons or others, they always approach you from a very biblical point of view. You think they're one of us. But you just say, hey, on down the street, this isn't the right message. And that Paul gets the same way. And she did this for many days. And Paul, greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And he came out the very hour. But when her masters saw that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. This is evidently they knew that she couldn't prophesy anymore. And how they knew that, we don't know. But all of a sudden, her fortune telling turned to a non-fortune telling. And they became very unhappy. So they grab a hold of Paul and Silas for jimmying around with their merchandise here. This slave girl that was dragging in their money for them and took them down to the authorities, because all the judicial things took place in front of the magistrates in a Roman system down at the public square. So they seize them and take them down there. And they brought them to the magistrates and said, "These men, being Jews, exceedingly trouble our city." Well, that's a very serious accusation, because the Romans didn't even allow a synagogue there. So they know the Jews are troublemakers in some ways. So they don't allow, it's a very serious accusation. These Jews trouble our city, and they teach customs which are not lawful for us, being Romans, to receive or to observe. In other words, these guys are treacherous to the state, the Roman empire. And we as Romans cannot tolerate this type of thing. Do something to these guys. Then the multitude arose together against them. And the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Now, if you consider most of these citizens as being former Roman soldiers, you see this is ordinary action for them. They don't mind beating the tar out of anybody and laying many stripes on them. I mean, this is not a friendly deal. And they don't just say, they don't slap their hand or anything. This is what the Romans, you cross the Roman army, and this was very common. All the former centurions and everyone there, they're right in there. Let's beat these guys are anti-Romans, and we're going to get rid of them. So they beat them very severely. And when they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. He doesn't just lock them up in the inner prison, he puts their feet in stocks. He knows that the civilians and the magistrates out there are not at all happy with these guys, so he secures them quite well and goes to sleep. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. I mean, I don't think that would be my reaction to the thing. I'd be probably licking my wounds and crying out to the Lord, "Why'd you do this terrible thing to me?" But they're exercising, as he does later in this book. He says, making your petitions known before God with thanksgiving. So they're doing it. They're singing these hymns, and the other prisoners are listening to them. They're not joining in to the choir, but they think they enjoy the music, I guess. At midnight, suddenly there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open, and everyone's chains were loosed. Well, an earthquake doesn't drop the chains off of prisoners, and it doesn't generally jar the doors open. It may bring the whole building down on you, but it doesn't do these type of deals. So you can see that there's an angel in this action someplace. Now, this is going to be serious. You remember Peter, when he was in prison by Herod? What happened? In the night, the angel appears and kicks him on the side, and he gets up and all of his chains fall off. He says, "Follow me," and he thinks he's having a dream, and the doors automatically open as they go through. It says automatic opening doors. Walk out to the street, and he says, "Go ahead and go." And he's out on the street, and then finally he realizes this is no dream. But this is a serious problem for the jailers. What happened? And you know what Herod did? He made an inquiry of the soldiers. It said there was no small stir among the soldiers the next day. And they knew what was coming down the pike, and so Herod made an inquiry, and you know what he did? He executed all those soldiers. There were guards that were guarding Peter. This is a serious business here. Anyway, the chains all fall off. In 27, and the keeper of the prison, awaking from sleep and seeing the prison doors open, supposed the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself, because he knew that if he lost his prisoners, if he didn't kill himself, the governor or whoever, the magistrates certainly would have killed him. It's Roman law. But Paul called out with a loud voice, saying, "Do not do yourself no harm, for we are here, all here." And he called for a light. See, he can't see them. They're still sitting in the dark prison. calls for a light, ran in and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. This guy has changed from being the master of the situation to one that's trembling with great fear before his prisoners. And he brought them out and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" He's looking into eternity at this point. Whatever has happened to this guy, he has changed from a peaceful, sleeping master of his prison to now trembling before his servants, his prisoners, and wanting to know how he could be saved. And so they said, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved, you and your household." You remember Lydia? Her household. Now it's his household. And when they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house, and he took them, this is the jailer, the same hour of the night, and washed their stripes, and immediately he and all of his family are baptized. This is all in the early morning. You know, he cleans them up, and he brought them into his house and set food before them, and he rejoiced, having believed in God with all of his household. This is all a transformation that's taking place after midnight and before dawn. And he cleans them up, fixes their stripes, feeds them food, and he and his whole family are baptized. They all become believers, just like Lydia and her household. And when it was day, the magistrate sent to the officers and said, "Let these men go." So the keeper of the prison, he probably thinks, "Man, this is divine providence. I'm going to get to let them, not only am I saved, I'm going to get to let Paul and Silas and these guys go free. This is good news." Saying, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Now, therefore, depart and go in peace." Well, the message that Paul has for him is not what he probably wanted to hear. Paul said to them, these are the messengers that also came from the magistrates with the jailer sitting there. Paul said to them, "They have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison." You know, that is serious. You could get killed for that. A Roman had certain rights even to appeal to Caesar. You don't touch a Roman citizen. Anyone that touched a Roman citizen got executed for any reason. I mean, they were holy territory. These guys were wrapped in the flag. "And they have thrown us into prison. And now, do they want to put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come themselves and get us out." And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. See, these magistrates, they're running a Roman colony. This is a serious matter. They've just gotten through beating very severely some Roman citizens without a trial. I mean, everyone can, they can appeal to Caesar and have all those magistrates put to death. And they came and pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city. They didn't force them out. They asked them, "Would you please leave?" They want this problem to go away. So they went out of the prison, and entered the house of Lydia. And when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. In other words, they took their own sweet time about leaving town. Okay? And the magistrates weren't going to put any pressure on them to leave. So they go out, they don't leave town, they go back to Lydia's house, have a little fellowship with the brethren, and then they're on their way. So you have a background here in Philippi. Who with? Lydia. You have some with a jailer and his family, and you have some with some other brethren here. You got a very strong tie to these people. Now, this isn't the only tie that he has with them. In his third missionary journey, he goes up to Ephesus, is there for 3 years, then comes up through Philippi, and then back down to Corinth and back up. And there's thinking that he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians at Philippi, either going in or the 1st Corinthians and then coming out with 2nd Corinthians. So he's there at least 3 times once in this first journey, and then in the second journey, and then twice in the third journey. So he knows these people very well, and he stays there. They're his point of contact when he goes out of there. He doesn't go by sea. He travels right through Philippi to go into Greece and come back out again. So that gives you some of the context of what we're looking at in Philippians 2. I'd like to pick up here in Philippians 2, verse 12. He just finished up with the situation of why in their servitude and fellowship. They're viewing in Philippi, this is an interesting book, as Larry and Mike have pointed out before. This isn't a book of correcting these people on a bunch of doctrinal problems or moral problems or other things. It's a very fine book of let's build this fellowship and remain one in spirit and one in heart and everything. It's not like Corinthians. It's not like Galatians. It's not like even Romans. This is a very unusual book. These people are close to Paul, very close, and he's close to them, and there has not been a big lot of trouble or rhubarb going on between them. He's encouraged them to continue on. This letter is as a follow-up of Epaphroditus, who we're going to meet here, who had come from them with a gift for Paul. We know from in the Corinthians also, they'd sent money to him when he was in Corinth. He says, out of their poverty. The believers there are not evidently largely Roman citizens. They're fairly poor people or stuff. They sent out of their poverty down to Corinth to him, a gift. This is the second one. When he's in Rome, they sent this guy Epaphroditus with money, gifts. He's in prison, house arrest, and they've taken care of him. And he's sending Epaphroditus back, and this is the letter he's sending with him. So he has this strong contact, but he's talking about them being humble in the relationship with other believers, not putting themselves ahead, but putting the other people. And he says, and he uses Christ as an example, who being the form of God, did not count it robbery to be equal with God, but finding himself in the form of a man, humbled himself even to the cross. So he's establishing a manner of conduct in this brotherhood or fellowship that we have in the church between God and the believers with believers. And do you remember what Christ said? A new commandment I leave with you. What was it? That you love one another. And these are all part of this whole book, weaving these different aspects together of what that means. And he's not castigating them, like I said, for morals or for doctrinal error, but just, he says, I want you to be one-minded. And he says, you have the example of Christ. Now he's going to go into several other examples of what that costs. There's a sacrifice for that. If you want to be humble, you have to sacrifice part of yourself for the benefit of the other people. If you want to benefit from this, he's going to show that I sacrificed for your sake. I'm in prison for that. Timothy has made sacrifices. He doesn't seek after his own things, but he seeks after who? Your things. Epaphroditus, he wasn't seeking after himself. He's seeking after yours. There's sacrifice in this. We are recipients of the sacrifices of other people. And his driving point is, therefore you make the same sacrifices. We're all in this together. And it costs each one of us for the benefit of the others. So he's going to start through there. Therefore, in verse 12, Philippians 2, verse 12, therefore, beloved, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. This is very interesting because he's been there. His presence has been there at least 3 times when he's writing this, maybe 4 times. And he says, you did good when I was there. But he says, I'm absent, continue to do the same thing, as if I'm there. And he says, and work out your salvation with fear and trembling. I think he's kind of maybe alluding to the jailer. What must I do to be saved? And he's doing it what? With fear and trembling. He says, continue that. It's not a one-time event. Your salvation is something that continues into the future. It's not that you're saved and then you can go do whatever you want to do. He's saying this is a full package all the way to the end. And he says, do it, and with fear and trembling. And he says, for this reason, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. And it wasn't as if they hadn't seen that. Did the Philippian jailer, had he seen the will of God carried out? Sure. It took the shaking of the jail and everything else. And they'd seen what Paul had cost him. He got a lot of whipping out of this thing for their benefit. He says, work out the same thing with fear and trembling because it's God who's working. This isn't your deal. God's working in you to carry these things out. Again, he appeals to the sovereignty of God, doing his pleasure, and he's working in you to do this. So be a willing participant. Do all things without complaining or disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights, holding fast the word of light, that you may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I may not have run in vain or labored in vain. We live in a day and age that is crooked and perverse. It's becoming more that way every day. We have a chance to be different, much more than we did in the 50s or the 60s. We've become more distinctive. We're easy to pick out of a crowd. I don't know if you've walked through, but you can almost pick believers out of crowds in an airport or someplace else. They're like lights shining in a perverse and evil generation. And I talked to a man who had been, he was the chairman of at an important university, had been the head of the whole department, and is a believer. He says, one of my deepest regret is that I did not enter into this discussion when I had it in academia on the Christian things such as evolution and things. He says, I could have weighed in heavily, and he says, I failed to do that. In our day and age, it becomes much more distinctive. If a man knows what's to do right and he doesn't do it, to him it becomes sin. And this man was bearing some of that burden of the past that he failed to do that. He was too occupied with his academics. A good man, not a bad man at all. And but Paul is saying here, you have an opportunity to be blameless and harmless in a perverse and evil generation. And about you, you'll see evil and perverse people. You have a perfect opportunity. The Philippians did too. They're living in a Roman colony, and I don't know if you know about soldiers and sailors, but they're not exactly the world's finest examples of morality and good language. You know, they say someone, he swears like a sailor or a soldier, you mean he's got very bad language. And most of these guys are that way. And so living in Philippi, they had a good contrast. These old soldiers are, you know, they're yucking it up and telling them, they've chopped people up in their lifetimes, and they express it in very vulgar language. He says, you have a chance to be different, and do that. Hold to these things and be blameless in this, and you'll shine as lights in this society. He says, also so that I want to know that my work among you was not in vain. I didn't put my life down and do this. He says, yes, and I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice of the service of your faith, and I'm glad and rejoice with you all. Paul also uses that toward the end of his life, this drink offering being poured out in 2 Timothy 4. But he says, but my time is near, in Timothy, he says. Here he says, I hope to be free again. But he's being poured out, and that was done in sacrifices. They pour out on the altar a drink offering that was consumed. And he says, I'm doing this for your sake and for your benefit. For this reason I am also glad and rejoice with me. But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly. Now you remember Timothy? He was picked up when? Right before he comes to Philippi. Don't you remember on his trip? Took him and had him circumcised. This is just days before he arrives in Philippi, so he's going to send him back again. He says, I hope to send him shortly, that I may also be encouraged when I know of your state. In other words, he's following up. He wants to know how the Philippians are doing. That's how much heartfelt he is. And he's sending his faithful servant Timothy to do this. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your estate. For all seek their own and not the things which are of Christ. He's saying basically, there's hardly anyone like Timothy to send out there who's going to look after your own benefit. These other people just look for their own. And he later has a bad experience with Demas and the others. Alexander the coppersmith, people that had been involved with him before, now became enemies. They sought after their own things. What does it say of Demas? He left for the things of the world. And he says, I'm going to send him so he can see through. But you have known his proven character, that as a son with a father, he has served me in the gospel. Therefore, I hope to send him at once, as soon as I see how it is with me. But I trust in the Lord that I myself shall come shortly. He not only wants to send him, but he hopes to return back to the Philippians. Then he goes on to Epaphroditus. Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered my need. He was the one that was sent out by the Philippians to take the gifts to minister to Paul in prison, and he's going back. Since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. If Epaphroditus had died there in Rome, it would have been a sorrow for the Philippians and for Paul. Lost a good man. But he says, therefore I'm sending him more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. In other words, Epaphroditus was supplying what they couldn't do by coming, bringing the gifts, and ministering, reciprocating, in other words, in this fellowship. Epaphroditus was their sacrifice and everything, but if he'd been lost, they would have been sorrowful and everything. And I'm sending him back. Even though he's helping me, I'm sending him back because you're greatly concerned, and it'll be a blessing to you to take him back. So in this fellowship, you see this thing's linked. The sacrifice of Paul, the sacrifice of Timothy, the sacrifice of Epaphroditus, and their sacrifice in sending to minister to Paul. You see how the things interlock? This fellowship requires sacrifice on the parts of other people to work well. And in the body of Christ, we have the same thing. Our fellowship is built on what we've benefited from other people. I was reached by a man who it cost him a lot to share Christ with me. He left a lot. And a lot of us are here. And some of you will be sacrificial. When we send out brethren to minister in other parts of the world, they're making a sacrifice. They're doing what we can't do there. And those people are beneficiaries of their sacrifices and of ours to support them. So this thing's all tied together. And he's building this up and saying, we have this benefit of this brotherhood because we're going to accomplish by sacrifices of each part more than we'll do individually.